Welcome to Interviews with a Contrarian. I'm Mark Milkey, Executive Director of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy. The Aristotle Foundation is a new think tank in Canada that will champion reason, democracy, and civilization. We're a nonprofit. We've asked for a charitable number from the Canada Revenue Agency, and as we await that, we are previewing some of the activities we will do at the think tank in the future, starting with Interviews with a Contrarian. This is a series devoted to interviewing mostly Canadian authors about their books. Today, I want to welcome Michel Gagné from Champlain College, St. Lambert, if I pronounced all of that correctly, who is a tenured lecturer. And he has a wonderful new book about a very continually topical subject, the Kennedy assassination. This seems to never go away. The title, Thinking Critically About the Kennedy Assassination, Debunking the Myths and Conspiracy Theories, published by Routledge Press. Michel, welcome to Interviews with a Contrarian.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start with the obvious question, which I like to ask all authors. Why did you write the book?
Why did I write a book? It's been percolating for 25, 30 years. I was a conspiracist. I don't, by the way, I won't use this word pejoratively. I just mean a person who believes in a conspiracy-based explanation for a certain event. So I was a Kennedy conspiracist, a 9/11 conspiracist. I believe the Freemasons were somehow running various governments. And I had to be, in a sense, deprogrammed, not in the kind of the cultish way where, you put a person in a room and kind of half torture them, but rather I had to start exposing myself to literature I'd been avoiding for quite some time. I had a political science background back in the 90s, at the end of the Cold War. It became kind of in vogue to see the United States as sort of the new Grim Reaper, the one kind of running the whole world, to almost feel pity for the Soviet Union. And I think, like many people my age, I read Chomsky. I followed a lot of. I watched the X-Files, these kinds of things, and then your mind starts to wander. You find out there's American propaganda, and before you know it, you kind of start latching on to these themes. It's the beginning of the internet. I'm starting to read a lot about various theories, and most importantly, I'd watched this film, which I actually have here, JFK by Oliver Stone, which many people my age, I think, watched this, and it was maybe their first experience in really getting deep into American politics. My background was in political science, but not American politics. So there was a lot of historical content there that was new to me, and it seemed rational. And I kind of jumped on the bandwagon, and it became kind of obsessive. And it's only when I started teaching at the college level, I was a high school teacher for a while, that I started teaching about conspiracy theories, usually explaining to students that they're most often wrong, but I always felt the Kennedy assassination was that one that got away sort of thing. And then I finally read the Warren Commission around 2010, 2011. And that's when I had a kind of a paradigm shift. I realized that a lot of what was in the film, in the Oliver Stone film, was actually inaccurate. It was actually reporting things, blaming it on the Warren Commission, and the Warren Commission had not said that. So it's a little bit like, I don't know, to use a more mundane example, it's like following that Johnny Depp, Amber Heard trial, and then realizing once in a while, hey, that didn't happen that way because you were there or you have other information. And then sort of the whole story begins to unravel. So I had this paradigm shift in the early 2000s. I met Jonathan Kay. I think he's a mutual friend of ours. He came to my college and spoke about 9/11 conspiracy theories. And he had written a book. And after reading that book, I thought somebody needs to do something kind of like that for the Kennedy assassination. So to make a long story short, I wanted to create a textbook that looked at the Kennedy assassination as a form of a case study in order to do a crash course in critical thinking.
We'll get into Oliver Stone and JFK in a moment and some of the conspiracy theories. Let's start, though, for viewers with your definition of conspiracy theories, perhaps.
Yeah, if you ask even some of the most erudite people in the field of, I say conspiratology, I don't think there's an official term yet, but academics who study the conspiracy theory phenomena, you can be as simple as saying a conspiracy theory is a theory about a conspiracy. And I've heard people like Joe Uzinski say that, and I very respect Joe Uzinski, but I don't feel it says much. It kind of just it really is kind of tautological. However, who was it? It was Kassim Kassam, a British philosopher who devoted a very thin book to conspiracy theories, but I think his definition was quite good. He said, there are conspiracy theories, small c, small t, which is we suspect that something is a plot, and we might even have a lot of evidence for it, but we don't know if we know the whole story, right? And that can apply to Watergate. He uses the gunpowder plots of was it the Guy Fawkes gunpowder plots in Britain in the 16th century. So there's always the possibility that we've missed some information, but we know a plot happened. So he calls that a conspiracy theory or a conspiracy, story with a small c and a small t. But capital C, capital T conspiracy theory tends to follow a predictable pattern, a little bit like there are Hollywood film genres. If you're watching a bromance film, you're watching a science fiction film, you expect certain things. When a director doesn't do that, either he's got a masterpiece on his or her hands, or it's a flop because people can't relate to the story. So I would say that conspiracy theories, capital C, capital T, they tend to follow a pattern that makes them believable because they're more of the same. So when you look at 9/11, JFK, the QAnon theories, they tend to often come back to a certain thing. A secret group is plotting for power. They're so powerful, they've destroyed the evidence. They actually have a single resource in mind. Sometimes it could be petroleum, it could be gold, it could be DNA, whatever it is. The story always has kind of these main elements. And I think Jonathan Kay highlights some of them, and other authors, I mentioned Kassim Kassam, mentioned some of them. So when you become kind of more aware of the pattern of conspiracy theories, you realize this is a genre of literature, a bit like dystopian science fiction. It's not actually newsworthy, or it's not news. Yeah.
Okay. My entry in conspiracy theories or interest in them started slightly differently than yours. I mean, back in the late 1990s, I was the Alberta director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and I began to get these faxes, it was the 1990s, and letters talking about how federal income tax was unconstitutional, and big eyes there when people expressed that to me in person and in letters and in faxes. And at one point, and there was a D-tax movement, it was called, that came out of Western Canada. I think it eventually migrated to Ontario and Quebec. And the allegation behind this was that there was this big conspiracy to tax us all federally, and that courts couldn't actually do this. There was all sorts of elaborate, threads tied together to try and prove this, in a sense. And at one point, it got so annoying and so overwhelming that we hired a former constitutional advisor, now since passed away, but Mel Smith, who had advised four or five British Columbia premiers over his time in public service in that province, who had to write an article for us in our magazine to explain that no, federal income tax is completely constitutional and you're misreading the Constitution. But it didn't seem to make any difference. I mean, this thing popped up again 5 years later, 10 years later, 15 years later under different names. So that was kind of my introduction to conspiracy theories. At least, personal introduction to it. But I do remember the JFK movie, and I had a very different reaction to it than you did. For a reason that perhaps we can go into in a moment, your distinction between simple historical kind of analysis or history reading and analysis. But my reaction to it, I remember sitting in the theater. Was it 1991, 1992 that it came out?
Christmas 1991, I believe.
Right. Yeah. And I remember being highly annoyed because for whatever reason, I don't recall why, I didn't already buy the conspiracy theory. And I remember thinking a couple of things. As I'm watching the movie, I'm looking at Kevin Costner thinking, for heaven's sakes, Oliver Stone, why didn't you just do the acting here? Because all of these words are exactly your beliefs about JFK and the assassination. Why didn't you just, and it was almost didactic. It was preachy. Mm-hmm. And then I was annoyed because, what was it, 2.5 hours? Maybe it's just a bad theater seat combined with my initial irritation. But by the end of 2.5 hours, my butt was sore. And I thought, this is 2.5 hours of my life I can't get back. But you reference JFK and Kevin Costner. And I mean, even George Will talks about it in a column around the time. The American columnist in the Washington Post longtime conservative writer, George Will, said that Oliver Stone falsified so much that he may be an intellectual sociopath indifferent to truth. So you saw the movie and then you moved away from it. And in your book, you make quite clear that Oliver Stone got almost everything wrong. Can you elaborate on that?
How much time do you have?
Well,
The movie is 3 hours long.
right.
That's the director's cut that's available now. You're right. It does come when you don't buy the story, then it does seem very didactic. I would argue he didn't invent that. There were a lot of films based on Ayn Rand novels that were like that. So if you've ever seen The Fountainhead, it's almost the exact same thing. It's like listen to Ayn Rand just ramble on in court. I don't know if you're a fan of Ayn Rand, but I see her as like the doppelganger of Oliver Stone on the other side.
You know, I've only dipped into,
not...
and I'm libertarian leaning, small c conservative philosophically, but I've dipped into Ayn Rand, which will disappoint my libertarian friends. But
okay, I've got her novels. I've read a lot of them. Book. She's an interesting writer, but again, it's very didactic. So what's wrong with the film? Well, to quote Vincent Bugliosi, I think he was exaggerating, but Vincent Bugliosi said the film had 3 things right, and that is the victim, the date, and the location. Certainly the film has more things right, but I kind of made a quick list of some of the things that I think are inaccurate in it. Let's see, where was that? Okay, so the first thing is the single bullet theory, and we can maybe go back on that later on. The Warren Commission never claimed that there was a zigzagging bullet that stopped and turned in midair. They claimed it went into a straight line. So a lot of that has to do with the positioning of the bodies, of the car, of the rifle, which I believe the film gets a lot of that wrong. The hobos, you know, there's these 3 men were not paraded through. They were just walked through Dealey Plaza. Pictures were taken of them by the press. And then suddenly it seems they disappeared. And for about 20 years, various conspiracy theorists, far before Oliver Stone got involved, identified like people like Frank Sturgis or Charles Harrelson, Woody Harrelson's dad. Who else? There's the former CIA agent who was one of the plumbers for Nixon. He's E. Howard Hunt. So there are all these theories about these guys were CIA contract killers, and it turns out no, the booking slips were misplaced at the police station because by 2 o'clock or whenever they were interviewing these guys, they realized they had found a suspect, Lee Oswald, and so everyone else kind of got shifted around, sent back home, and the homeless men were homeless men, but it was only in the 1990s that this was discovered, and yet it's still repeated in a lot of places. Some of the other things. The whole Garrison line is a complete red herring. Jim Garrison existed, and he certainly did prosecute a lot of petty crime and homosexuals and local rackets. Interestingly enough, he stayed away from the mafia, including in his Kennedy conspiracy theories, because he was afraid of Carlos Marcello. So it's interesting how Jim Garrison blamed everyone except the mafia to kill Kennedy. That would have probably been the most logical person to blame in a place like New Orleans, but I think Jim Garrison suffered of what we call the streetlight fallacy. You know, the drunk man who looks for his keys underneath the streetlight because that's where the light is best, not because that's where he dropped his keys. And so Garrison, only having authority in the New Orleans parish, that's the only place that he could actually arrest people. So he came up with a few people like Clay Shaw, David Ferry. They are the main characters of the film JFK, but it turns out they have nothing to do with the Kennedy assassination. They're peripheral people, perhaps connected in some way or other, at least for David Ferry, with organized crime, but nothing that seems to relate to Lee Oswald or the Kennedy assassination. I don't know if you want some more. General Ed Lansdale, who is like the Darth Vader of that film, he's blamed as the mastermind of the assassination. Now, he's a powerful guy in the Pentagon, so it's easy to pick on a guy like that, particularly when he was alive. He was, you know, he had signed secrecy agreements. He couldn't talk about what he did for the CIA or the Air Force. And then after he died, you know, they could say whatever they wanted about him. He couldn't sue them. So Lansdale ends up looking like the evil character in this film. And it turns out Lansdale was actually a very close associate of Bobby Kennedy and very much respected by John F. Kennedy. And he was on the out with the CIA and the Air Force. So he's not the kind of guy someone would have picked to organize an assassination. When you get into Lee Oswald's personal life, you find out he's not the kind of guy that someone would pick either to keep a secret or particularly to assassinate a president in a team. He was not a team player. And both the Russians and the Cubans figured that out. But it seems that many Americans today still think that Oswald was a secret agent. I had a friend of mine at hockey just last weekend try to argue that point with me. The point was not successful because I just read, what's his name? Norman Mailer's 700-page biography of Oswald. And there's just one more source that shows how erratic and narcissistic and possibly mentally ill in the sense of having a personality disorder this man was. So he certainly was not CIA material.
I read Norman Mailer's book as well. Part of it I found a bit annoying, and he almost leaps into some conspiracy type thinking at some points himself. Nonetheless, I thought what was useful about Mailer's book about Oswald was his time in Russia and also how they reacted, the Soviet Union at the time, and how they reacted to Oswald. Basically, they didn't trust this guy, and he wasn't some high-level source that they could take advantage of because he was so erratic, and he was a loner. And the same thing when Oswald visits Cuba, at least according to Mailer, if I recall correctly, and maybe Gerald Posner as well. The Cuban embassy shuts him down. They want nothing to do with him. And yet the left kind of skipped over it. This was a Marxist loner who really hated capitalism or hated the West, which is why he went to the Soviet Union in the first place, became dissatisfied, and then tried to go to Cuba when he became dissatisfied with his own country again. So is there something there in terms of why did the left ignore Oswald's Marxist connections?
I think Oswald's personal life is an inconvenient truth for people who are trying to construct a different narrative. He just doesn't fit that mold. So people like Oliver Stone say you need to ignore Oswald. He thinks it's a distraction. Mm-hmm. And then there was this philosopher in the 60s. I forget his first name. Popkin was his last name. Left-wing philosopher who made up this crazy theory that there were two Oswalds from the time that he was young, and one of them was being manipulated around in the Soviet Union, things like that. He was the assassin, and then there was a real Oswald who was the patriot who went to the Marines and things like that. So it becomes a very inconsistent, very complex story based on very little fact at all. Oswald had a very troubled youth, spent some time in orphanages, although his older brother spent more time than he did. His mother was both controlling and emotionally cold, never met his father. He had a stepfather that he really liked, but ended up cheating on his mother, and they had a divorce. So there was an element of feeling kind of abandoned. He felt abandoned by his older brothers, who went off to the service as soon as they could to get to get away from their mother. And he did the same. So why did he join the Marines? Well, he wanted to get away from mom, and he wanted to learn how to shoot a gun. He wanted to see the world. And at that time, for a guy of his background, that was the best and cheapest way to do so. All through his time in the military, the other soldiers call him, Oswaldkovich and things like that, because he's clearly egging them on, with his kind of very infantile Marxism. When they're playing chess, he always wants to play with the red pieces. He says, I prefer the Red Army. There's all these different little stories about him. And although conspiracy theorists might say this is all part of the cover-up, it started when he was 15. When he was in New York, wandering the streets, going to the Bronx Zoo instead of going to school, he got a leaflet about the Rosenbergs. And to this day, I become more and more convinced that Oswald, though he didn't talk much about his personal feelings, there was something about the Rosenbergs he admired. They stood up for some values, for a sort of a humanist pacifism. They were pro-Marxist, they were atheists, and all of these things resonated with him. And ultimately, they were arrested, they went on trial, they were executed, and they became heroes. So when Oswald gets arrested after this very quickly planned assassination, he had less than a week to prepare it, and the night before, it seems he still had second thoughts. He doesn't have a getaway plan. He is getting away, but not to jump ship, in order to make it hard and to make sure he gets caught in public, to make sure there's cameras on him, to make sure he's going to get a high-profile trial. While he was incarcerated during that weekend of November 1963, he's asking his brother and his wife to contact John Abt, ABT, who was this high-profile New York lawyer who defended many Marxist activists. He never got to contact apt, but that was his hope. So clearly, on his mind, there was going to be a trial, and that's where he would stand and proclaim, the gospel of Marx. Perhaps convince the Cubans they made a mistake of not letting him in, and maybe basically just pointing a middle finger to the Soviet Union and to the United States, two countries he had learned to despise by then.
He also thought of himself as an intellectual, didn't he?
Yes.
This comes through Mailer's work. And I can't figure out whether he really did have some deep smarts that were not developed, but he certainly seemed to think that he did, that he would write some great, tome like Marx and become famous that way and influence the world. And yet he didn't have the discipline really to, think through all of this in some sort of systematic way or come up with something original. Much as I think Karl Marx was deadly wrong, there was some sort of appeal to it, given when it was written and reasons for that. But Oswald just seems like someone who was undisciplined, lazy, but did think of himself perhaps more highly than he ought to. Is that a correct impression, or was there something deeper there, and perhaps again just that wasn't developed, and perhaps he could have been a brilliant something in some other field?
I think the laziness is selective. Whenever his heart wasn't into something, like many people who have personality disorder will just abandon it. They see it as either they're a victim or it's a waste of time. Other people are stupid. There are many personality disorders that lead people to be inherently oppositional with authority figures. So he suffered of some kind of thing like that. He wasn't diagnosed except when he was a child. When he was found to be a truant, they did identify him as having, some kind of oppositional disorder. He was fairly smart, and that's the problem with the angry lone nut argument, is that he was self-taught. To give a parenthesis, my dad had a grade 9 education, was raised on a farm, and was a truck driver for life. But I'm a church-going person, but I've never met a Christian pastor who had read the church fathers as much as my father did. I still have like his collection here in my bookshelf, and he's reading like Hilary of Poitiers, and he's reading Saint Irenaeus. Most Protestants don't even know these books exist. So here's an example where I had a father who did not have a lot of school education, but who loved books and was self-taught, at least in matters of theology that mattered to him. For Oswald, it was Marxism. It was, what he called political philosophy. It was all a little bit simple because obviously he didn't go to school or university where he would have been compelled to read, thinkers he didn't agree with. So he was self-selective, but most of his education came from the public library. He was an avid reader, and he was fairly articulate. The problem is he had dyslexia. So when it came to writing books, he tried to write a book. He wrote this kind of a diary when he was in the Soviet Union or on his way back on the ship, trying to describe life. And if you've read the Mailer book, at the end, there's like a 20-page or so excerpt, and it's remarkably boring, right? It's really just very encyclopedial, just mundane day-to-day activities in Minsk. It's not even about all the Soviet Union. It's just what he observed. So yeah, I think he was less than he thought he was. He had illusions of grandeur. He thought he would become a leader in the Soviet Union or in Cuba, and he couldn't understand why people didn't want him. So I think the word narcissism is appropriate to describe him. A very different narcissism than someone like Donald Trump, obviously. Nonetheless, an inability to understand how other people think and an exaggerated view of himself. At the same time, a certain emptiness where he craves admiration, it's just not coming. So the lone part, not the nut part of Angry Lone Nut, I think is what created most of the frustrations for Oswald.
Let's jump then to Dealey Plaza and the bullets that day, and the magic bullet, and also Kennedy's head that snaps back, I guess it is. And we'll get back into kind of conspiracies in general, and link them to some of the conspiracies, more recent conspiracies. But one often hears this as offered as definitive proof that it couldn't have been Oswald acting alone. Now, I've been in Dealey Plaza, as I'm sure have you, right? It's a very small area. And I've been in the book depository, and you look down, there's not a lot of distance between that office, 5th floor, 6th floor, whatever it was, and the plaza and the car that Kennedy was in and the other cars. But the argument in Oliver Stone's JFK, which I think revived kind of a lot of the conspiracy theory mongering about that day. You will hear from the conspiracy theorists that, how could this bullet have struck both Connally and Kennedy? And it had to zigzag, go up and down. And you describe this in your book. And I should do a bit of a commercial break again here for your book. I'm talking with Michel Gagné, author of Thinking Critically About the Kennedy Assassination, Debunking the Myths and Conspiracy Theories. So, Michel, tell us a little bit about why this Oliver Stone portrayal of this erratic bullet going all over the place is wrong, but also tell us why, it's a bit grotesque, but why Kennedy's head would have jerked back, which is where people say, well, he must have been shot from the front in addition to the back. There must have been at least two gunmen.
Okay. Can I show a picture on here? Will
Sure.
that turn out? So, because a picture is worth 1,000 words. So here's a diagram in my book. Can you see this?
I can.
It's like that zigzagging bullet that is alleged to have taken place, according to the Oliver Stone film. And he didn't make that up. I think Robert Groden and many other conspiracy theorists came up with it. Now, notice the difference in this picture. Now, again, this is a diagram that was made by my friend Joan Lijo, who I do a podcast with. So notice the straight line. What has changed here is the position of Governor Connally's body. He's slightly turned to the side, and that's because it turns out the first bullet, not the second bullet, missed the car. And that is a combination of things. When many ballistics experts relooked at the evidence and discovered that when the first bullet was heard, which many people took to be a firecracker, Abraham Zapruder had not started recording the sequence, the deadly sequence yet. So that means that the Zapruder film, which is often seen as the prime piece of evidence to reconstruct the assassination, is incomplete. As the limousine turned the corner, Zapruder was not filming. Other people were. Now, there's no direct evidence of the shot being taken, but those people remember hearing the crack when the car was at a particular position. So that means
we should say, Governor John Connally, who knew rifles inside out and knew what just happened.
And I will get to that in a second, because so what happens is the first bullet misses the car. That means that the shooter, assuming it's Oswald, had not 5.6 seconds, but actually something more like 11 seconds, 9 to 11 seconds in order to shoot 3 bullets, which is much more doable. So if the first bullet misses, Governor Connally begins to turn. His hat is dropped slightly, and he begins this turning motion, and that's when he gets shot in the back. Not realizing that the same bullet hit Kennedy. He thought Kennedy got hit by that first crack he heard. He began to turn. He gets shot, and he falls over. Now, here's what's interesting is Kennedy does not fall over. Now, they don't get shot in the same place, granted. His body lurches forward slightly. His arms come up in a neurological spasm because the bullet grazed his spinal cord without breaking any bone. And then he kind of locks there. And what's interesting is that many history books don't record this because it wasn't known for 20 or 30 years. President Kennedy, people knew he had a very bad back, but did not realize that he was wearing a fairly consistent back brace, a corset around him, which restricted his motion. Which ironically, here's where sometimes there's a little bit of humor in things like the Kennedy assassination. It's when he came 6 months earlier or so to Canada, and that Prime Minister Diefenbaker had him dig up, the first shovel full of dirt for a new hospital in Ottawa, that he aggravated his back again. Right, Kennedy had surgery on it twice. So it may be that Prime Minister Diefenbaker is partly responsible for Kennedy's death, in the sense that his back not healing, he's wearing this restrictive corset, which prevents him from falling over, as Governor Connally did, into the arms of his wife. So he's basically a sitting target. He gets shot this time in the back of the head. His head explodes. The Zapruder film does record, now it happens very fast, so just in a few frames, a forward lurch, and then after that, a slower fall to the left and back. Now, I am not a forensic or a medical doctor or a forensic expert, but some are. Here's an interesting book, Larry Sturtevant, The JFK Myths. And Sturtevant explains how the natural the natural reaction of a person's muscles is to flop backwards when there's a neurological spasm in the brain. So even when shot from the front or the side or the back muscles are stronger and they'll pull the body backwards. So it's not that Kennedy was thrust back into the left. He was thrust forward to the maximum movement with the brace. And then after that, he fell back as the neurological spasm, perhaps the car accelerating. I don't know that Mrs. Kennedy pulled him back, but all of these things may be factor in explaining this back into the left movement. So people like Oliver Stone use it as a false dilemma. If you go backwards, you were shot in the front, which is what you see in the movies. So a lot of times we assume that Hollywood tells us the truth. It turns out the people making movies don't know guns sometimes any more than the people watching them. And the special effects crew does whatever the director tells them to do. So they want blood, they get blood. They want someone to fly out a window, they fly out a window. But that's not how presidents get killed in real life.
Now, these details are rebuttals of the conspiracy theories, but as you point out, this may not necessarily make any difference to those who believe in the conspiracy that day. And there's a reason for that. Now, you go into that, and even your own development out of believing the conspiracy about JFK or conspiracies. You mentioned in the book, thinking critically about the Kennedy assassination, that you're trained, Michel, in history and not formal logic. Now, explain why this matters, because I think there's something there.
Yeah. So, well, I went to McGill. I did a joint honors, double major plus with like seminars and things like that, where I majored mostly in Canadian history and Canadian political science. So I was not an expert on Kennedy. And maybe that's the problem, is I came to Kennedy only listening to one side of the argument. But as an historian, what happens is you're trained to look for facts that correspond with a particular story, right? So to use a philosophical phrase, the correspondence theory of truth is how well can we back up certain claims with visible, observable things in the physical world. Philosophers don't think that way, and perhaps neither do lawyers and other people who have to not necessarily do the forensic investigation themselves, but look at the cohesion of the story. So I think what was missing, it's not that I was an illogical person, is that you can say premise 1 and premise 2 are true, and the conclusion is true because you know it from some other way, therefore the argument makes sense. But it turns out that apples are red, roses are red, violets are blue, do not amount to fudge being delicious. Although all facts are true, they don't have anything to do with each other. So it's kind of a stupid example, but I do use it in class often to show how just because you have the truth, it doesn't mean that your argument is correct. And so Kennedy may have gotten, even if he were shot from the front, even if the Vietnam War would have been stopped in his second term. I don't believe in either of these things, but even if those two things were true, it doesn't prove the CIA did it. You see, so that's the problem a lot of times with conspiracy theories. They'll take facts or factoids, things that are either known to be true or believed to be true, and then reach a conclusion that feels right. There's a kind of a visceral, this is the story they want to hear. They attach those things and ignore everything else that doesn't match. There's definitely an element of confirmation bias in the way that conspiracy theories are often constructed.
There is something there in terms of, well, and what struck me about that comment you made in the book, you were trained in history and not formal logic. This explained an argument I had last year with an historian who I won't name, but an excellent historian by all accounts, and has done some great work on Canada and Canadian history in the past. But he believes in the conspiracy theory of 2020 and the election being stolen away from Donald Trump. And I thought, how can this deeply serious historian, an intelligent person, believe this? And it wasn't until I read your point about, there's perhaps a lack of analytical logic going on here in the background that explains it. So he believes a good story. as opposed to taking an empirical, maybe scientific approach, right, and a philosophical approach. Let's expand this though now from the JFK assassination conspiracy theories, and these conspiracy theories have gone on for for as long as humanity has been around, I imagine. I mean, I read a book about Pearl Harbor explaining why Franklin Roosevelt did not know Pearl Harbor was going to happen, but that was conspiracy theories in the 1940s. So the question is, I suppose, why do intelligent people believe this? Like, what's going on in their brains? Because it's not just a right-wing thing. It's not just a left-wing thing. You can pick particular conspiracy theories. And in your book, you mentioned that initially believing in JFK, a conspiracy against JFK was a lot more a left-wing phenomenon than a right-wing phenomenon. But we have examples of right-wing conspiracy theories. And maybe the way to expand this, this analysis here is in the book, you compare Oliver Stone's JFK movie to another movie, Memento, by Christopher Nolan. Can you expand on that a bit? Because I think that actually sheds some light again on the mindset of the conspiracist, in terms of JFK, but then Christopher Nolan's movie Memento, and two different approaches, really.
Yeah, I like to go to the cinema, not to draw examples for real life, but rather to use them as thought experiments. And I think I use those two films in the opening. First of all, you can't avoid talking about the Kennedy assassination without talking about Oliver Stone's ongoing, because it's not just that film. He's doing documentaries now that essentially say the same thing. So you can't ignore Oliver Stone. But then I thought, Christopher Nolan made this film that, although it's very different in many ways, and both films, I think, are brilliant. They're great works of cinematography, great directing. The problem is, how do you tell a story? So Oliver Stone's Garrison, Kevin Costner's character, is basically the knight in what's it called, the knight in white armor, right? Or the white knight in shining armor, whatever the expression is, right? He's the guy who's going to, pardon me?
Knight in shining armor.
Yeah, exactly. So he's going to go against the establishment. He's going to bring down the entire edifice of corruption. From the beginning to the end of that movie, he is the projection of the viewer. You're the good guy up against this horrible evil. You're the Luke Skywalker or Frodo, right? That's what he represents. Kind of the myth of the hero who goes up against horrible odds. And at the end, although he's almost taken apart, he's vindicated that he was right all along, even though the system remains, right? So that's how JFK presents the protagonist. Christopher Nolan gives us a much less lovable and much less sympathetic character in Leonard Shelby. So Lenny he can't remember the past, and he can't make any new memories. And so what happens is he knows his wife got killed. That's part of the memories he still has, but he's out to kill his wife's killer. And the whole movie, and I'm going to spoil it here for people who haven't seen it, but it's still worth seeing just for the cinematography. Here, the character is constantly on the wild goose chase to kill his wife's killer, when it turns out he killed him a long time ago. He just can't remember. So there's a scheming police officer, and then there's these other kind of drug-dealing grifters who take advantage of Leonard, keep feeding him false information so that he'll go and kill other people on their bidding. And what happens in the end is that Leonard finds out that it's all been a shill. All of the tattoos and the mementos, the Polaroid pictures he's been taken to kind of remind himself of what he's doing, they're all wrong. And he ends up in a moment of kind of a lucid self-hatred to just destroy all of them and start over, forget the present, and go back to hunting his wife's killer. Why? Because that's the story he wants to hear. So both of these films are about self-deception. However, we understand by the end of Memento that Leonard Shelby is a kind of a wretch. He's a wretched man whose beliefs are wrong, but he keeps obsessively trying to do the same thing. In the other film, we come out sympathizing with the protagonist, who's utterly deluded if we read about Garrison and the whole history of the Kennedy assassination, but we come out thinking, aha, we're vindicated. So I think there's an element of projection in JFK that is it's aborted in Memento. You can't get out of Memento and think, yeah, I'm a victim. You say, victims can be self-deluded and become victimizers. Whereas in JFK, the victim, and here I'm maybe, here I've got your book up there, the victim is always a victim, and they can do no wrong. And, the truth is always on their side.
And also the psychological goings on in the mind of the character in the last film, in Nolan's film, in Memento.
Yeah.
You understand what's happening psychologically in the mind of the killer, right? And you're not sympathetic to it, or at least you understand the confusion that's going on. So that's
right. I'd like to see a movie that does that for Lee Harvey Oswald, but he's an opaque character. Any movie about Lee Harvey Oswald will have to be, to carry a lot of assumptions, because, his thinking process, he's a black box, and that's why he's usable in so many different ways. People ignore the behavior, they ignore the origins, the life experiences, and they just mold the black box in accordance to what they think he would have done. It's an exercise in false projection of the self.
So back to conspiracy theories on a grand level, or expanding it even from the movies here. I've observed, you hear, people say, look, conspiracies exist. And I would agree that conspiracies exist. As I've written in columns on occasion, look, everyone knows that, Mossad acts as, as the Israeli intelligence agency. And on occasion, they kill their enemies. There's no big secret about that. The CIA acts to protect, the United States, and, occasionally interferes in elections in other countries, at least historically in the 1970s, and so on and so forth. Two men can conspire to kill a third. So conspiracies exist, but the distinction I try and draw for people is that there's a vast difference between minor conspiracies, or maybe we can call it limited number of people conspiracies, and these grand conspiracies, right? So again, there's a difference between two people conspiring to murder a third, and 9/11, the conspiracy theorists, again, getting away from the actual 19 hijackers, but those who think, well, no, this was a government plot involving thousands of people. There's anti-Semitic strains of that, or the 2020 election, where despite all the advice or pushback that Donald Trump got, including from his Attorney General, Bill Barr, and I doubt Donald Trump believes his own words, nonetheless, the conspiracy theorists will argue that, hundreds or thousands of people were in on stealing the election. There seems to be this difference. So, because you have to say, look, yeah, people can conspire, and so what, right? Or even the White House under Richard Nixon. To me, actually, this is definitive proof that, look, actual conspiracy theories, eventually come apart or are known, right? The moment the pressure is on the White House, on those who conspired in Watergate, I mean, they start talking to prosecutors and singing like birds. So is this the distinction that people don't make, or conspiracists don't make, between these entirely plausible minor or limited number of people conspiracies and these grand, world event conspiracies that would necessarily involve thousands of people in a cover-up?
Yeah, conspiracy theorists will argue, and there may be some truth to the fact that when you have a group of people who are sworn to secrecy, or their work is compartmentalized, like when they were building the atomic bomb, then one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing, and a very few number of people can control a plan. Or members of the Mossad, members of the CIA, not only do they sign confidentiality agreements, there's a long process of them being drafted and trained, so that by the end they wouldn't want to. They'd rather eat cyanide than reveal what they do, because they're that kind of person, and they've been selected in order to fulfill certain acts that they believe to be right. So I think you're right in the sense that the more people you involved in a conspiracy theory, the more unlikely it is to be true, right? Is that famous Occam's razor. Yeah. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but the more you add on human beings, free moral agents, who, as immoral or corrupt as they can get, they all have interests. And when your interests go against self-destruction, you're going to sink, right? Mafiosos have sometimes spilled all the beans in court, because they're thinking, if I'm going to go down, I'm taking them with me. Right? John Dean did that. I don't know that John Dean was necessarily a good man, but when he sang in front of the Senate for Watergate, and others did too, it's because they didn't want to go to prison on their own. They thought, I've worked too hard to make my career, and if the president made me do these things that are immoral, then damn it, I want the world to know as well.
Yeah.
So I think every human being has their breaking point. Few people will go to their grave doing something they knew was wrong and was against their own interests. At the very least, they'll do what's useful for their family or for their, their retirement fund or whatever. It helps to learn about human nature. Humans are capable of doing a lot of good, but they're also fickle. They're also greedy. They're also sometimes very ignorant of what else is going on. So conspiracy theories have this kind of grand vision, say about the Kennedy again, about what could have been done in 1963. But the people in 1963, people, for instance, planting a bullet in a hospital room, have no consciousness. They have no idea what the police is going to find, in Dealey Plaza, that might make this the extra bullet that doesn't fit the idea that there was a single shooter. So that's the problem here. Even though it might seem possible from the outside that a group of schemers could pull away this plan, it's only if they had the kind of knowledge that only gods and demons have, this sort of outside
Omniscience.
Total knowledge. Yeah, omniscience. So it's what James Meigs, who was, I don't know if he's still there, but he was one of the editors of Popular Mechanics magazine. And I remember when he was involved trying to debunk the 9/11 conspiracy theories, he would often use this phrase, the myth of hypercompetence. So this belief that the group who is the enemy not only is so secretive and powerful, they can hide their own existence of what they do, but they somehow can foresee the future, or they can predict what other people are going to do, or where other evidence that does not yet exist is going to be found.
The myth of
That's the problem.
hypercompetence is exactly right. So it's also that people mistake power for the ability to control outcomes, to control events to a desired outcome. And I think about this in relation to politics. So I served a bit under Jason Kenney when he was opposition leader and worked on the campaign in 2018, 2019, putting the platform together. And I'd known this at a distance. I mean, my background is political science, and I've been around policy wonks and politicians enough to know that governments are not necessarily as organized behind the scenes as you think. In terms of potential outcomes. They can waste a lot of money. They can do a lot of dumb things. They're thrown off by the morning headlines. But people, I think, is it also that conspiracists attribute, again, too much ability to control events to powerful people. But power doesn't equal outcome. So you can order an army into war. You can't guarantee you'll win the war. But also, just because you can order hundreds of thousands of people into action, say George W. Bush after 9/11 in Afghanistan or in Iraq, that doesn't mean that somehow you could conspire to hide some event that involves thousands of people. And in fact, the more powerful you are, the more watched you are, right? And back to your point about interest, people have their own interests. I often think, if we grant for a moment the conspiracy theorists, their 9/11 theory, all right, so the people around George Bush, they have their own characters. They also have their own interest. And the moment he tries to organize a 9/11 conspiracy theory, it's going to leak right away because A, they're not going to go to jail, as you said, and B, some of them have character that wouldn't allow an attack on their own fellow Americans, and so on and so forth. And C, it assumes that George Bush, who was mocked as less than something for a long time, could organize something like this without it ever being discovered. That's just not the way politics actually at a high level works. You're actually watched all the time. And in fact, behind the scenes, there's a lot more disorganization. I mean, on the Kenney campaign, I would get emails. I don't think I'm telling too many stories out of school here, but I would get emails at 2 a.m. from the now former premier during the campaign wanting to change something on a news release that we were going to release at 9 o'clock in the morning, sometimes major revisions. Nobody would have seen that from the outside, but there can be great chaos at the last moment that can mess up anybody's plan. So it occurred to me that people give far too much credit to governments or corporations to control outcomes. And I've noticed the same thing with corporations. They are scared of morning headlines. They can be, they can be pushed around by activist groups who are much smaller, have a much smaller budget. People think money and, the ability to, spend billions of dollars is the same thing as controlling outcomes, and it's not. Is that another problem with conspiracists? They don't actually understand the dynamics of power and money.
Probably because most conspiracy theorists are on the outside. Even a populist politician is not part of the system, so doesn't understand necessarily the years and years of finely negotiated compromises that have gone into some practice that everybody does until the new guy shows up and says, well, this is corruption. And it might not be corruption. It might not be particularly ethical either. but it might be something that everybody thinks is for the greater good, or at least the people in power. The vast majority of conspiracy theories come from a place of helplessness. So when you're outside of the halls of power, or you perceive yourself as being threatened, you're going to see enemies coming at you. Again, that says a lot about the human ego. We would rather think that people are out to get us than to realize sometimes how insignificant we are to the powerful people. So conspiracy theories boost the ego in the sense that you may be petrified of a major enemy, but somehow you feel you're being noticed, you're being watched. I interviewed Joe Uzinski in my podcast once, and and I told him this story that when I was really deep into the Kennedy conspiracy stuff and 9/11 had just happened, I walked out my apartment once in the winter and my car was gone. And my first thought was the CIA took my car. Now, it took about 3 minutes for me to go, no, that's just stupid. But the fact that I had that instinct is because I'd been reading a lot of books that told me I'm very important because I know the truth. They're out to get me. Now, in the end, what happened is my car got towed 3 blocks so that the snowplow could come. And I slept in that day because it was a snow day. I didn't go to school. I didn't teach. And so I didn't hear the tow truck that came and started ringing to take it away. Mundane explanation. But we don't usually look for the mundane explanation. One thing I say to my students, now they're 17, so I don't want to be crass, but it might come out as crass, but I think it's fairly simple, and that is most real conspiracies are effing around and covering your ass. In the sense that if you think of the Kennedy assassination, I don't think anybody except Oswald conspired alone to kill Kennedy. But that doesn't mean there wasn't other conspiracies. The CIA had been trying to kill Castro, right? So let's do whatever we have to do for national security. The president says we need to neutralize Cuba. We can't invade them anymore because they'll bring in more missiles, whatever it is. So let's just kill the beard. And then, other conspiracies. The FBI didn't want to show that they actually knew who Oswald was. They knew where his wife lived. They went twice. They sent an agent twice to find him and ask him why he went to Mexico City. And it turns out they didn't catch up with him until after the murder. They were lackadaisical. They didn't think that a Marxist would kill Kennedy. They thought the Ku Klux Klan would. The CIA, they lost the pictures or films, the recordings they had of Oswald in Mexico City. It sounds incredibly evil until you realize how roughshod sometimes some of these operations are. They happen in an apartment across the street where somebody's taking pictures. The pictures get developed. Some of them end up being overexposed. A tape gets taped over again for another. No one thought Lee Oswald was a special man in September 1963. He was a nobody. So why keep that tape? You tell the FBI there's an American here going to the embassy, looks fishy. Why don't you check into it? It's your job, not ours. And then the CIA goes about its business. So most conspiracies that I've seen that turn out to be true are this sort of thing. Jean Chrétien passing envelopes full of money to try to make sure that more signs with red and no appear in Quebec in 1995. It didn't kill anybody, but it was unethical. The Iran-Contra affair, that was unethical, but it's done kind of slipshod. It's done in a way that, because it's done through back channels, there's no system, there's no bureaucracy looking after the conspiracy. So naturally, it ends up looking like a dog's dinner, and that's how they often get exposed, right?
And they are exposed,
running around, making it up as they go along.
And they are exposed eventually, right? Even so, that's part of it as well. And people mistake. You're onto something as well in your book, thinking critically about the Kennedy assassination and all these other factors, and your notion of a narrative where people tie it together in a very neat storytelling package after the fact, right? And it's the same with the investigation into the book about Pearl Harbor. I forget the name of the author, but it was a book that came out, I believe, in the 1940s, 1950s, somewhere on my shelf. But they made the same point about white noise, right? There's all sorts of intelligence, that intelligence agencies are getting, the U.S. government was getting about activity in the Pacific, and they thought there was going to be an attack by Japan somewhere. They just assumed it was going to be the Philippines, right? And you also miss stuff that you don't put together. It was like 9/11, where why would you look at training schools for flying an airplane and look for guys from Germany, Arab-looking guys from Germany? Why would you do that before 9/11? You can, after the fact, look back and go, oh, okay, something happened there. But people like to tie these things together after the fact. But at the time, it's a non-event, so to speak, or there's so much white noise that you can't possibly sort through it all the information coming in a way that gives you a clear indication that Japan is going to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. You think something's going to happen in the Pacific, you just don't know where.
Yeah,
So
and we don't realize how often the authorities do stop potential plots. You know, I do have a friend who was involved in, there was a bombing that almost happened in Canada of a Via Rail bridge, 1015, I forget, it was a Quebec-based Muslim guy. And now, in that case, you know, CSIS and the RCMP worked together in order to stop this plot. Would it have even happened? It was so in the beginning stages that it turns out it may not have happened. But there's an example that most people never hear about. You know, the authorities are constantly finding potential threats. Which one of these might slip through the crack and become the ultimate threat, right? The guy who went into Parliament with a rifle a few years ago on Remembrance Day. He's a lone wolf. You know, these people are like a needle in a haystack. You know, same thing with the incel guy who went on a driving rampage in Toronto. Are you going to stop every truck with the potential that someone in there wants to use it to harm people? So a lot of times these murderous events, particularly if they're done by a single person or a small group of people, are very, very hard to find. That doesn't mean that the government is letting them happen on purpose. They've already stopped many of them. You know, Oswald, in other words, Oswald kind of slipped through the cracks in the same way that many other people like him have. The Unabomber is an example, right?
Right. And sorry, and I'm just thinking about the Unabomber. I just watched a show on him recently. And again, the lone wolf is especially difficult to find. I mean, the Unabomber was a great example. He's in the middle of Montana in a cabin with no electricity and no internet, as I understand. And he was eventually outed by his brother after the Unabomber insisted on something like 35,000 words being printed in the Washington Post and the New York Times. You know, it's interesting that maybe there are conspiracy theories that peg someone else is responsible for the bombings and not the Unabomber. I'm sure that's on the net somewhere. But yeah, lone wolves are difficult to find. And again, you don't know about them until you know about them, in the case of Lee Harvey Oswald and his plans. So
I was, if I can interject,
please.
I was in Oklahoma City last summer looking at the memorial there. And I talked to a number of different people, and it's clear that there was a conspiracy there. It was a small conspiracy. And even then, Terry Nichols and I forget the other gentleman, they kind of backed off at the end. They didn't want to finish the job. And McVeigh ended up being the lone wolf who set off the bomb, though it turns out there was a conspiracy. It was a fairly low level one, and it was by these militant right-wing militarists who were very angry about Waco and Ruby Ridge. Again, you know, that's the kind of conspiracy that happens, usually the violent ones, and they get discovered because people's self-interest is to back out at the last minute or to expose themselves. You know, Oswald and McVeigh didn't seem to have a getaway plan. They got caught.
You talk about the need to critically think, which is easier said than done. I mean, how do you teach people to critically think? I mean, you get to do it in college, at Champlain College, but most people aren't necessarily going to take your classes, even though they should. Michel,
I'll charge them for it. I'd be happy
and
to teach them.
you can put them online. But people are going to believe conspiracy theories because we're storytelling human beings. We love a good yarn. But tell us a little bit about left-wing conspiracies, and then honestly, if there's anything that can be done to sort of lead people away from the conspiracy swamp into reality, as Jonathan Kay talks about people being anti-reality who are involved in conspiracy theories. But first of all, we talked a little bit about right-wing conspiracies, although Oswald was a lone left-wing Marxist. What about left-wing conspiracies? What are some of the more famous ones you think in the last 100 years or so?
Well, it depends on where you put the line between left and right, of course. And also, we have to understand that not all conspiracy theories are motivated by political ideas, but they usually have to do with power. So there's always some kind of a political dynamic there, even if it's not the government. People on the left tend to be more suspicious of large corporations. We can think of big pharma. And, you know, so lately we could see a lot of conspiracy thinking in people who are opposed to vaccines, perhaps, although people on the right, it was an element, it was about freedom. People on the left, it was about safety, right?
I was going to say that actually, maybe expand on this as well. Have some of these conspiracy theories that used to be, you know, on just the left or whatever, migrated over to the right?
Yeah, there's a funny mixture. There's a professor, a former professor at the University of Syracuse called Michael Barkin. Here's his book, A Culture of Conspiracy. I also interviewed him in my podcast. Michael Barkin talks about how the line between left and right has gotten fudged in some places, for example, with UFO conspiracy theories. And to a certain extent with 9/11 as well. People on the right and people on the left find different reasons for believing the conspiracy theory. When you look at it closely, they end up being like the same conclusion, 9/11 was an inside job, but the premises, the reasons given are often very different. So many conspiracy theories from the left tend to be anti-corporate or to tend to oppose maybe war rackets. So it's not that George W. Bush didn't launch a war in the Middle East, and I think there was probably some deception involved in the whole weapons of mass destruction thing. But what we saw, if you remember, in 2004, there was a lot of people talking about a stolen election and about American voting machines being rigged. Well,
you mean 2000, the close race, Democrats,
but in 2004 as well.
Okay,
there was I remember a documentary which was like called Outfoxed or something like that, and there was another one. So Fox News and George W. Bush were targeted in a lot of documentaries. Think of Michael Moore's documentaries. So from the left, there's a certain anti-statism because the state is associated with corporate power, money, and war. So I mentioned vaccines, a lot of holistic medicine, for example. So the opposition to big pharma. You watch Democracy Now, and I wouldn't say that it's as conspiratorial as, say, Breitbart or some other right wing or WorldNet Daily or something. But there definitely is that kind of sometimes conspiracy paranoid thinking about those things. Oliver Stone goes back to Democracy Now every now and then. So it's one of those programs. It's a radio program and an internet TV program that often will highlight events that they believe are part of some kind of cover-up. But what's interesting about Barkin's book is to show how, for very different reasons, people on the left and some people on the far right have started to say similar stories about the UFO phenomena. But that's because one group believes in some kind of a new age progressive knowledge, like, say, free energy, that is being withheld from us by the government. For another group, it's that maybe UFOs are really secret statement are being used by the state in order to brainwash people and to take away their freedom, right? To create like FEMA camps or things like that. So the conspiracy theory itself might appeal to the left and to the right, but for different reasons, because they come with different fears and different expectations. So I don't know, I've named a few there. I'm going to be very cautious here, but I refer to people like yourself and Jonathan Kay and also Jonathan Haidt to say that in academia today, there's a lot of conspiracy type thinking, although it's often not identified as conspiracy theories. The fear that there is an oligarchy, an economic oligarchy running the country or the world, patriarchy, colonialism. A lot of these words are being thrown around in not such a different way as people who used to blame the Jews or the Freemasons or some other group like that, right? It's like they're lurking in the background, controlling government.
Would you put concerns about the World Economic Forum in the same sort of category, where they're attributing perhaps too much power? To me, the WEF is simply another organization with, yes, plenty of high profile celebrities, politicians, very wealthy people. And my argument is, yeah, so what? I mean, they have their views. I was president of a small C conservative organization here in the country, Civitas, which had some thinkers, historians, academics, journalists, a few politicians scattered in once in a while, and some people saw that as a conspiracy of the right. It's just, look, like minds get together and discuss things. Now, some have more influence than others, obviously. If you're Bill Gates and, whoever else, of course you have some influence, right? Good and bad, I suppose, depending on your view. I mean, I happen to agree with, his funding of scientific research and the rest of it. But are the concerns of the WWF sometimes overblown and quasi-conspiratorial as well, especially these days?
I think so. I haven't researched it as much. I do know a couple people who are like constantly talking about that group and its plan to take over the world or something like that. I see it a lot like the Bilderbergers. They've been around for a long time. They are an elite group. They meet in a hotel once a year or whatever, and they share ideas. And those ideas can be very influential because they take them back to the states and the corporations where they work, and those ideas start moving around. But then so do labor unions. You know, like it's not like the Socialist International was just meeting to have tea. You know, they were talking about how to bring about a socialist world economy through revolution or through evolution or some combination. So are these groups all conspiratorial? I would say they're conspiratorial once they start using the levers of power and actually overturning elections or manipulating the media or things like that. But for them to meet together and share ideas, humans do that all the time. Right. You know, when the cardinals get together in the Catholic Church and determine, you know, is this the year, yes or no, to let women, you know, into the priesthood? Is that a conspiracy? I mean, that's what cardinals do, right? So at some point, you have to understand that a community of people discussing an idea, it's not conspiratorial until it actually gets put into action, and that action is necessarily nefarious, illegal, or whatnot.
And maybe that's a good place to almost close it off here, though I do want to ask you what can be done. But what you're pointing to again is banal explanations don't satisfy people. People are not satisfied by the banal, tragic reality that a lone gunman in Dallas, Oswald, killed an American Adonis, a popular president or quasi-popular president, who was representative of the majority of the country at the time, i.e. young, right? And much of America was young. This was a tragic event. And it's grating to think that some lone wolf, what did you call him? Nut job?
Yeah, an angry lone nut.
Angry lone nut with a couple of bullets, who had actually a skill for marksmanship, was able to take down the most powerful person in the world at that point. That's unsatisfying emotionally, isn't it? It's also unsatisfying emotionally to say, well, look, of course, rich people are going to, gather together in Switzerland, and some of them may be completely out of touch with reality on the ground and try and ban fossil fuels or whatever, because it's never going to affect them personally, or whatever the grievance is, or whatever the annoyance is. But this is banal. People do this. They do get together, but these banal explanations are not satisfying to people. So what can be done? Jonathan Kay talks about anti-reality folk. You talk about trying to get people to critically think. Outside of your classroom, how do you get people to critically think about this?
Yeah, I have a few points here. Many of them are pilfered from other authors. Just before, I want to say that Lee Oswald is part of a much larger myth. Not everybody believes a conspiracy theory, but a lot of people have misconceptions about the context of the events surrounding the assassination. And most importantly, I would say that there's a story in people's minds that often involve a very simplistic version of John F. Kennedy as not just a hero figure, but practically a messiah, a man who's going to bring world peace and whatever. And Lyndon Johnson as a form of devil figure. Who caused the Vietnam War. He becomes the Judas in the story, and Kennedy becomes the Jesus.
Forgetting that the Kennedys, their father aside, were pretty pretty anti-communist. Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy.
You've got a picture of Reagan there. I think one of the politicians before Reagan who was most like Reagan was John F. Kennedy, both in his view of the Soviet Union, his view of government intervention. There's a whole bunch of things like that. In many ways, Kennedy was a liberal. He was a Cold War liberal, and he was willing to use the powers of state to slow down the spread of communism. And he was not willing to overstep into the powers of states and of companies and things like that in order to bring in basically something the Soviets would approve of. Right. So that's what I want to point out is there's a greater myth here. So one thing specifically about the Kennedy assassination that could help people is to, if they're good readers, is to read the history books by Robert Dallek. He's written a comprehensive biography of Kennedy and a two-part biography of Lyndon Johnson. And what happens is when you take Kennedy off of his pedestal, he's not a messiah, he's just a normal guy, and you realize that there's a lot of good despite a lot of the things we don't like about Johnson. They become normal people. And in that kind of story, a guy like Lee Oswald just becomes part of the chaos of history. Yeah. But here's some things that I think various authors might point out. Robbins and Post point out the symptoms of paranoia. So it'd be useful to identify what are the triggers that make us fearful and how do we behave when we are afraid. We tend to isolate ourselves with like-minded people. We tend to have the mentality that other people are out to get us, and then we start getting arrogant, acting grandiose around them. We become hostile, right? These are like different things we can realize when we are getting a little too excited for the wrong reasons, and same things in the people we talk with. We need to tolerate more uncertainty. We need to be able to say, look, I don't know the whole story. It may be someone else was involved in Watergate, but what we know is enough to say that justice has more or less been done, including the pardon, the pardon that everybody hates of Gerald Ford pardoning Nixon. At the end, Ford did exactly what he wanted to do, and that is, let's move on to something else. And then he opened the books on the FBI, the CIA. There was the Church Committee, the Rockefeller Commission, the HSCA came out all during those years, right after the pardon of Nixon. So yeah, a lot of people don't like the fact that Nixon didn't go to prison, but it did allow Ford to kind of open the books and bring more transparency to the state. We need to ask a lot of questions, and particularly, what's the perspective that I'm missing? Or what's the evidence that if I did have it would change my mind? That doesn't mean the evidence is out there, but if you don't start with kind of understanding what it is that the whole theory depends on, and that if that ends up being wrong, then we must rethink our theory. I think that's of some importance. We have to trust authorities more, but not blindly. People who have an expertise, say in ballistics or in forensics or whatever, in this case, historians, a lot of times they know their material pretty well. They don't always get it right. But, William Manchester and Robert Dallek, who I've mentioned, these are the types of people who are most likely to look at the whole gamut of what happened to Kennedy and report it more objectively.
Well, a basic empirical investigation is what you're suggesting. You have to take into account the strongest arguments from the other side.
That's right.
Which is very, very much a philosophical position. If you want to get to the truth, you can't, set up straw men. That's too easy. You knock them out. But you must,
and preferably you want impartial spectators. This the line by Joe Uzinski is, an impartial spectator is a person who doesn't care from the outright what the answer is. They just want to find out what the truth is. And even though most academics do have, they do have biases, the system of peer review forces them to always be open to being second guessed, right? So being an impartial spectator may be something that's foisted on you, but by submitting my book to Routledge, as opposed to, say, self-publishing it, I was exposing myself to peer review, and I did have to change a number of things, clarify them, add some parts to the book. Here's something that you might not expect. Conspiracy theories tend to kill our sense of humor. They tend to make us think that the world is against us and it's a dangerous place. Right. Now, I'm a practicing Christian, so I believe in an afterlife. That doesn't mean I'm not afraid of death or I'm not afraid of suffering, but it does give me a certain hope that if nothing happens in this life to address injustice, justice will be served, right? And Immanuel Kant often said, that's the one reason you have to believe in something like a God. Because if you don't believe that justice will be served, how can there be morality? How can we have rules? How can life actually have a sense of purpose if there isn't a higher sense of justice? So by not feeling that it's our job to make sure that we squash the conspiracy or that we actually expose it to the world, sometimes we need to see that there's a lot of irony in life. Pizzagate is kind of funny once you get past the fact that a man walked into a pizza parlor with an AR-15 rifle. He says, show me the basement where the children are being kept. And there was no basement. I've been there twice now. The pizza's really good. Yeah. I chatted with one of the managers who was there the day of the shooting. So a lot of this is kind of really, it's not funny, but there is an irony at the end.
Well, humor defangs the intensity of the moment, right? Or the intensity of the person. Although the person who is a conspiracist wouldn't like to be the subject of that. To end as well is maybe with a very simple analogy. There are two possible simple analogies. One is just because the sun rises and the crow, what are we saying? The rooster
crow rises
and the sun comes up. Doesn't mean the rooster caused the rising of the sun. But the other one is Occam's razor. Is that perhaps the simplest way, or at least one way to cut through a lot of this? Can you explain what Occam's razor is to our viewers who don't know that concept?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I can go back into medieval philosophy. That's not my field. But William of Ockham, though he probably never said the phrase, he's attributed by saying that when you're looking for the best possible answer, it's usually the one that has the fewest assumptions. So I often will ask my students not what happened here or what happened there, but I might say, which is the simplest explanation for the bullets in Kennedy or something like that. And it turns out, even though there could have been other shooters.
Yeah, let's stick with the bullets in Kennedy or Dealey's Plaza, because that's exactly a great example of the Occam's razor in practice.
Yeah. When you find the bullets, the bullet fragments, the bullet wounds, they point to the 6th floor of the book depository or thereabouts. So you don't need a man on the grassy knoll who fired once and missed everybody in order to say that Oswald was guilty and justice was served. Did a guy get away? It's possible, but no one saw him. There's no pictures. There's no evidence. You could clutch at evidence, like saying there's footprints and cigarette butts and things like that. And a few people remember strange things 30 years after the fact. Some of them are just trying to get attention. Other people might just have a bad memory. But at the end, it wouldn't have stood up in court. So I think Occam's razor tells us, look, we still might be wrong at the end, but given the facts that we do have, what's the best explanation? And so if you think that you could win a court case out of it, then the odds are it's probably true. I don't know if Johnny Depp is a wife beater. He very well could be, but Amber Heard wasn't able to prove that in court. So at the end of the day, we could say Johnny Depp probably didn't beat his wife. He may not have been a nice guy, but he probably didn't beat his wife. At least that's what the jury concluded, with very strict kind of, legal rules. So yeah, Occam's razor and tolerating uncertainty is the best way for not losing your marbles in life, I think, and being as close to the truth as you can be, but always be willing to change your mind.
Well, thank you, Michel, for sharing your marbles today with us. And I enjoyed this conversation. I've been talking with Michel Jacques Gagné and his new book, Thinking Critically About the Kennedy Assassination, Debunking the Myths and Conspiracy Theories. I'm Mark Milke, Executive Director of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy. We will have another episode of this sometime in the future, but do check out our website at aristotlefoundation.org. Thank you all. Thank you, Michel.
Thank you.